Okay, so the lawyer read my name, and next to it in the will, it just said $1. Not a typo, not a placeholder. $1 written out like it mattered. Like someone had actually sat there and typed $1 into a legal document about my father's $2.3 million estate. And under that, there was a note. My dad's own handwriting, copied word for word into the will. She never tried hard enough. That's it. That's the whole sentence. I sat there in that office for I don't even know how long, just staring at it, and my brother. I could feel him not looking at me, which somehow was worse than if he had. Anyway, that's where this starts. But it is not where it ends, not even close, and I promise you, by the time I get to the third part of this, you're going to understand why I'm telling this story at all. My name's Laura. I'm 36. I work in medical billing, which I know sounds boring, and honestly most days it is, but it pays okay, and I've been at the same hospital system for 11 years, and I like the people I work with, which counts for something. I was married once for about 4 years, didn't work out, no hard feelings really, we just wanted different things. No kids. I live alone in a townhouse I actually own, which, believe it or not, is going to matter later, so hold on to that. My dad, his name was Walter. He built a chain of hardware stores. Started with one in, I think it was 88, maybe 89. My memory on the exact year is fuzzy. And by the time I was in high school, he had 6 of them across 2 counties. He was proud of that. Rightfully, I guess. He worked hard for it. I'm not going to sit here and act like my dad was some cartoon villain who did nothing right in his life, because that's not true, and it's not fair either. My mom passed when I was 13. Cancer. It was faster than the doctors even expected, and I think I've thought about this a lot over the years. I think my dad just kind of shut a door somewhere inside himself after that, and never really opened it back up. He remarried about a year and a half later. Her name is Renee. And Renee came with a son from her first marriage, my stepbrother Dennis, who was 15 at the time, 2 years older than me. And look, I'm not going to pretend Dennis and I hated each other or anything dramatic like that growing up. It wasn't like that. It was more just, there was always a version of the family that made sense on paper, and I wasn't really in it. Dennis played football. Dad loved that. Dad went to every single game, home and away. I think he missed maybe 2 games in 4 years. I ran track. I was actually pretty good, made regionals twice. Dad came to 1 meet. 1. And he left early because Dennis had a scrimmage. I don't say that to be dramatic. It's just how it was. And you kind of adjust to it, you know? You stop expecting the thing you're not going to get, and you find some other way to feel okay about yourself. I got good grades. I got a scholarship for part of community college, worked the rest of it off myself, night shifts at a pharmacy counting pills and stocking shelves. Dad paid for Dennis's whole 4 years at a state school, no scholarship needed, and then paid for grad school after that too, when Dennis decided he wanted an MBA. I never asked Dad for tuition money. I don't know why. I think some part of me already knew what the answer would feel like, even if the actual answer might have been fine, and I just didn't want to find out. I got married in my late 20s, like I said, didn't last, and through all of that he was present, I guess. He showed up to the wedding, gave a short toast, said something about how he was proud his little girl had grown up. It was nice. It just also felt like a line from a card, you know? Not something he'd actually sat and thought about beforehand. Renee, I'll be honest, I never fully warmed up to her, and I don't think she ever fully warmed up to me either, and we both just kind of silently agreed over the years to be polite at holidays and leave it there. She wasn't cruel to me exactly. It was more subtle than that. Little comments. Once, at a Thanksgiving maybe 6 years ago, she asked me, in front of everyone, if I'd thought about going back to school for something more ambitious than billing. I remember my dad laughed at that. Not a mean laugh, just he laughed and didn't say anything to defend me, and I remember going into the bathroom afterward and just sitting on the edge of the tub for a few minutes before I went back out there with a normal face on. Dad got diagnosed with lung cancer about a year and a half before he died. He'd smoked for decades, quit in his 50s, but I guess it had already done its damage by then. And here's the thing, I found out about the diagnosis almost 2 months after everyone else did. Dennis knew. Renee obviously knew. I found out because I called on a random Tuesday just to check in, and Dad mentioned it kind of sideways, like, "Oh, did nobody tell you?" I figured somebody would have told you. Nobody had told me. I was upset about that. I'll say that plainly, I was really upset, and I brought it up to Dennis on the phone a few days later, and he just said, "It's been a lot, Laura. We didn't want to overwhelm anyone. It wasn't personal." Which, I don't know. Maybe it wasn't personal to him. It felt pretty personal from where I was standing. I started driving up more after that once I knew. About an hour and a half each way, every other weekend, sometimes more. I'd bring groceries, sit with him. We'd watch whatever golf tournament was on, which I don't even like golf, but he did, so I'd sit through it. Renee was around during some of those visits and gone during others. She had a sister a few towns over she'd go stay with sometimes, said it was too hard being in the house all the time with him sick, which fine, grief is grief. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what that felt like for her. But it did mean that a lot of those weekends, it was just me and Dad in that house. And I want to tell you about one specific afternoon, because I think about it a lot now. It was maybe 4 months before he died. We were sitting on the back porch, and he was having a decent day, breathing okay, and out of nowhere he said, "You know, you're the only one of my kids who ever just showed up without me having to ask." And I didn't really know what to say to that. I just said something like, "Well, you're my dad," which is such a nothing thing to say, but it's what came out. And he got quiet for a while after that, and I thought maybe I'd said the wrong thing, or maybe he was just tired. I genuinely don't know, but he didn't bring it up again after that. Not directly, not in so many words. About 2 months before he passed, things started changing at the house. Renee started talking about getting things organized, bringing in paperwork, and there was this cousin of hers, a guy named Gerald. Actually, wait, I should back up. Gerald wasn't a cousin. He was Renee's second husband from way back, before she even married my dad, and they'd apparently stayed friendly, which I didn't even know until later, and Gerald happened to be a lawyer.
Convenient, right?
He started coming by the house more, and I'd ask Dad about it, and he'd kind of wave it off, say Renee and Gerald were handling the paperwork side of things, and honestly, at the time, I was just relieved somebody was handling anything, because dealing with a dying parent is exhausting in ways nobody really prepares you for, and I didn't have the energy to push on it the way I probably should have. I offered more than once to help with any of that stuff. Insurance, the will, whatever needed doing. Every time, I got some version of "it's already being taken care of." And I believed that. I want to be honest about that part because it's easy now, knowing what I know, to act like I should have seen something coming. Maybe I should have. I don't know. At the time, it just felt like my dad's wife and her lawyer friend were doing the boring administrative stuff, so the rest of us didn't have to, and I was grateful, not suspicious. Dad died on a Sunday morning in October. I got the call from Dennis, and he said, and I remember this weirdly clearly, he said, "Well, that's that then," in this flat voice, like he was talking about a package that had finally shipped. Not, "I'm so sorry." Not, "Are you okay?" Just, "Well, that's that then." I hung up the phone and sat on my kitchen floor for probably 20 minutes before I could make myself get up and start making calls. The funeral it was fine, I guess. Renee had planned all of it already, which I found out when I showed up, and there was a whole program printed with readings and songs picked out, and my name wasn't anywhere on it, not as a speaker, not as anything, even though Dennis got up and gave this whole speech about carrying Dad's legacy forward that ran, I swear, close to 20 minutes. I gave a short thing at the end, kind of unplanned, because I asked if I could say a few words, and Renee looked a little surprised, but didn't say no in front of everyone. The will reading happened about 3 weeks after the funeral at Gerald's office, which now made a lot more sense to me why it was Gerald's office and not some neutral estate attorney, but at the time I still didn't think much of it. We sat around this table. There was a box of tissues in the middle, which I remember thinking that's an odd thing to have just sitting there like it was expected. Gerald read through the boring parts first, the legal language, revoking old wills, all that. Then he got to Dennis's portion, and Dennis got the stores. All 6 of them, plus most of the investment accounts. That's most of the $2.3 million right there. Then Renee got the house and a trust for her ongoing expenses. And then Gerald cleared his throat in this way that I now recognize as him bracing for something, and he said my name and read the number, $1, and then the note. She never tried hard enough. I actually said out loud, "Is this a joke?" And nobody laughed, which somehow confirmed it wasn't. I looked at Dennis. He was looking down at the table, not at me, and I couldn't tell if that was guilt or just discomfort, and honestly, I still don't fully know which one it was. Renee had a tissue pressed to her eyes, and I remember, I don't know why this detail stuck with me so much. She was wearing this cream-colored blazer, really put together, not exactly funeral appropriate for someone who's supposedly still grieving weeks later, and something about that blazer just sat wrong with me the whole meeting. I didn't cry in that room. I want to say that clearly, because I think people expect the crying part to happen right there, and it didn't. What happened was more like my hands went cold. Actually cold. Like I'd been holding ice. I remember looking down at them on the table like they belonged to somebody else. I said thank you to Gerald, which in hindsight is such a strange thing to say in that moment, but it's what came out. And I got up and left and sat in my car in the parking lot for probably 45 minutes before I trusted myself to drive home. That's part one, but what happened next is where things really started falling apart. Part two coming right up. So for about a week and a half after the will reading, I just kind of went through the motions. Went to work, came home, didn't really talk to anyone about it, which, looking back, was probably not the healthiest way to handle it, but that's genuinely what I did. I told myself the money didn't matter, that I'd never expected an inheritance in the first place, and some of that was even true. But the note, she never tried hard enough. That part one could not get past. I'd be sitting at my desk at work, in the middle of entering claim codes, completely unrelated task, and it would just show up in my head out of nowhere. 6 words. I'd have to stop and just breathe for a second. My friend Katrina, who I've known since community college, she's the one who finally got it out of me. She showed up at my place uninvited on a Saturday with Thai food, said she wasn't leaving until I told her what was going on because I'd been weird on the phone for 2 weeks straight. I told her everything sitting on my couch, and I remember her face just kind of falling when I got to the note part. She didn't say anything for a second, and then she said, "Laura, that's not about whether you tried. That's about him needing a reason that wasn't I let my wife handle everything and didn't check." I didn't fully believe her at the time. I do now, but at the time I just kind of shrugged it off. Then, about 3 weeks after the will reading, I remember it was a Wednesday because I was on my lunch break, eating a sandwich in my car in the hospital parking garage. My phone rang, and it was Gerald's office. My stomach just dropped. I figured it was something about signing off on the $1, some final humiliating piece of paperwork. I actually let it go to voicemail the first time. Called back like 20 minutes later because I couldn't stand not knowing. Gerald picked up, and something about his voice was different than at the will reading. Slower. He said, "Laura, I need you to come in. Alone. Not Dennis, not Renee. There's something I should have told you sooner, and I've been sitting on it, and I don't feel right about that anymore." I asked what it was about. He wouldn't say over the phone. Just said, "It's between you and your dad, really. I'm just the one who has to deliver it." I went in 2 days later, my day off. And I want to say, walking into that building the second time felt so different than the first time. The first time I was numb. This time my heart was just pounding the whole elevator ride up. Gerald sat me down in a smaller office, not the big conference room, and he closed the door, and he said something like, "Before I show you this, I need you to understand I'm putting myself in an awkward position because Renee's ex-husband recommended me to your dad's family originally, and I've known Dennis a long time. But I've been doing this a long time too, and I can't sit on this anymore." He opened a drawer, took out a folder and a sealed envelope. He said about a year before your dad passed, before Renee and Gerald's whole will handle the paperwork thing even started, your dad had come to him alone. Not with Renee. Alone. And asked him to set up a trust, separate from whatever will got drafted later, funded with money he'd move out of the estate specifically so it wouldn't be part of whatever Renee eventually had drawn up. The trust was in my name. Just over $310,000 sitting in an account that had nothing to do with the hardware stores or anything Dennis got. I just stared at the paper. I didn't even really process the number at first. I kept rereading the part that said Laura and my full name, my actual name, in a legal document my dad set up alone without telling anyone. I asked Gerald why he'd do that and then still let the will say what it said. And Gerald kind of sighed and said your dad told him, and I'm going to try to get this close to exact. Laura doesn't need my money to know she did right by me, but she should know I saw it, even if I never said so out loud. Which, I had to put the paper down for a second. I couldn't read anymore for a minute. There was a letter too, sealed, that Gerald had been told to only give me privately if I came to him on my own, which apparently was Gerald's own condition, not my dad's, because he said giving it to me in front of Dennis and Renee felt wrong to him. I'm not going to read the whole letter out here because some of it's just mine. Honestly, it's private in a way I want to keep private. But the short version is, he apologized. My dad apologized. Said he'd spent years measuring things the wrong way. Said the diagnosis made him see it clearer. Too late. He admitted that himself. Too late, but he saw it. He said watching me show up every other weekend without ever once complaining or asking for anything back had made him ashamed of how loud he'd cheered for Dennis's football games and how quiet he'd been at my one-track meet. I cried in that office. First time since the will reading. Not the cold, frozen thing from before, just actual crying, kind of mess. Honestly, Gerald had to get me a glass of water. But then he said there was more, and I want to tell you, this next part is the part that really changed everything, not just for me personally, but for what happened with Dennis and Renee too. Gerald said while he was setting up that trust quietly, he'd come across some financial records because he had to trace certain accounts to keep them separate. And he found that in the final year of my dad's life, more than $140,000 had moved out of Dad's personal accounts into accounts connected to Renee and Dennis, labeled as loans, never repaid. And 2 of those transfers happened in the last 6 weeks before Dad died. Using a power of attorney Renee had gotten during that time, a power of attorney my dad had specifically told Gerald in that earlier private meeting that he did not want given to Renee alone, without me involved too. Gerald was careful how he said this part. He wasn't accusing anyone outright. He said there could be explanations. But as the executor, he had an obligation to say something, and he thought I had a right to have it looked at properly. I sat in my car in that parking lot afterward, different parking lot this time, Gerald's building, and I just kept thinking about those last 6 weeks. I was there some of those weekends. I remember Dad being tired, more confused some days than others. One time he called me by my mom's name and then apologized right after. Seemed embarrassed about it. And apparently that's the window where 2 big transfers happened. Under a power of attorney he never fully wanted set up that way in the first place. I called a lawyer of my own that week. Her name's Priya, no relation to my friend Katrina. Different Priya, I know, small world, and she does probate litigation. She looked over everything Gerald had given me and said pretty plainly that what she was seeing had the shape of undue influence, maybe worse, and that the trust itself was solid no matter what. That was already mine regardless, but that I had real standing to challenge those last transfers separately. I sat with that for about a week before doing anything. I'll be honest, some old part of me kept whispering that going after this would make me the greedy one, the one who couldn't just accept a bad hand and move on with some dignity. I actually called Katrina and asked her, kind of half joking, half not, "Am I a bad person if I do this?" And she just laughed, not meanly, and said, "Laura, you brought him groceries for a year and a half. Ask yourself who the bad person actually is here." Priya suggested we give Dennis and Renee a chance to explain the transfers before filing anything formally, partly as courtesy, partly, I think, because she wanted to see how they'd react. So I called Dennis, told him I needed to talk, him and Renee both, about some things Gerald had shown me. He sounded almost amused on the phone, said something like, "Laura, if this is about the will, I really think you should just let it go. Dad made his choice." I told him it wasn't just about the will. He got quiet for a second, then said, "Fine, come by Saturday." I drove up to that house, same porch where Dad and I had that conversation about me showing up, and sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten probably 1,000 meals growing up, and I told him what Gerald had told me. The trust, the letter, the transfers. I watched Renee's face just kind of drop the practice part of it, the softness she does at funerals and family stuff. And Dennis didn't even try to look sorry. He leaned back in his chair, actually leaned back, arms crossed, and said, "So what? Now you're going to sue your own family over paperwork because you got $1 and your feelings are hurt?" And I said, and this part one remember word for word because I kind of practiced it in the car without meaning to. I said, "This isn't about the $1, Dennis. This is about 6 weeks where Dad wasn't fully himself and money moved out of his accounts anyway." Renee's voice came in sharp, all that softness gone. You have no idea what it was like being here every single day while you drove up every other weekend and thought that counted as caretaking. I never expected what came next. That's for part 3. Okay, so I didn't really have a comeback ready for that, if I'm honest. I just kind of sat there for a second because, part of me had that guilt sitting right there under the surface the whole time that maybe I didn't do enough thing and Renee knew exactly where to press. But then I thought about the letter in my bag, the one Gerald gave me, and I said, kind of quiet, I offered to help. Every single time. You told me it was handled. And Renee didn't really have anything to say to that. She just looked away. Dennis stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor, that loud, awful sound, and said something like, "You're actually going to drag Dad's name through court over this." And I said, and my voice didn't shake, which honestly surprised me more than anyone, I said, I'm not dragging anything anywhere that wasn't already there before I found out about it. I left that house and didn't look back, and I know that sounds like a movie line, but it's genuinely what happened. I just walked out to my car in the dark and drove home, and didn't cry once the whole drive, which was new for me at that point. The legal stuff took a while. Longer than I expected, if I'm being honest. Almost 7 months, total, of depositions and financial records getting pulled apart, and one really uncomfortable meeting where Renee's own lawyer basically admitted, in so many words, that the transfers in those last 6 weeks couldn't really be justified as clearly being what my dad would have wanted, given how his health was at that point. The court ended up ordering a good chunk of that money back into the estate, to be redistributed closer to what Gerald could show my dad had actually intended before Renee's side redrew things. It wasn't some big dramatic courtroom moment with gasps, nothing like that. It was mostly just paperwork and waiting rooms and me checking my email way too often. But by the end of it, between the trust, which was always mine regardless, and the settlement from the recovered transfers, I ended up with just over $590,000 total, which I still have trouble saying that number out loud without feeling a little strange about it. Dennis and I haven't spoken since that day at the kitchen table. It's been almost a year now. I don't know if that'll ever change. For a while that really bothered me, kept me up some nights, but I've kind of made peace with it, or at least I'm getting there. I think some relationships just end quietly like that, not with some big blow up necessarily, more just you finally see clearly what it actually was, and you stop pretending it was something else. I used some of the money to finally finish paying off my townhouse outright, which, remember I told you to hold on to that detail earlier. I own it now, free and clear, no mortgage, which is honestly one of the best feelings I've had in years, just knowing that's mine. I put some of it into an account for my niece, actually, Dennis's daughter, who's 7, because whatever happened between me and her dad, that's not her fault. And I didn't want that money to just disappear into being Laura's revenge fund, or whatever people might assume. I wanted at least some of it to mean something forward-looking. I still think about my dad's letter sometimes. Not all the time anymore, but sometimes, usually on quiet Sunday afternoons, which is when we used to talk on the phone. I've made a kind of peace with who he was, somebody who loved me in a way that was real. I do believe that now, but late and quiet, buried under a lot of years of measuring things by the wrong stuff, cheering loud for football games and staying quiet at track meets. I don't think that makes him a great father, if I'm being totally honest. I think it makes him a person who ran out of time to fix something before he understood it needed fixing. And he left me one true sentence in a letter that ended up mattering a lot more to me than the $2 million he left somewhere else. If there's anything I'd want somebody to take from this, and I'm not great at wrapping things up neatly, so bear with me, it's that the people who are supposed to see your worth don't always get to be the ones who decide it. I spent a really long time trying to earn some kind of gold star from my dad before I figured out that gold star was never really his to hand out in the first place. It was just mine. It always was. I don't need anybody's permission anymore to know I tried hard enough. I know it because I'm still here, still showing up for the people who matter, still choosing every day to be somebody I actually like being. And in the end, that ended up being worth a lot more than $1. Or $2 million, honestly. If any part of this felt familiar to you, if somebody in your life ever tried to put a number on what you're worth, I hope you don't let that be the only ledger that counts. Thanks for sticking with me through all 3 parts. I'll talk to you next time.